oneself a Christian is becoming even more difficult. Sometimes it can be politically good to do, but to really stand up for right Christian values, to stand up for values as outlined in the scriptures, is becoming harder and harder. One Catholic bishop, and we hear more Catholic bishops talking about this from time to time, are increasingly acknowledging the fact that the church in many ways has lost its voice in society as one of authority and is now just an opinion, and it's an opinion that's increasingly not being listened to but being ignored. Ongoing scandals in the church, you have to admit, hasn't helped, and the voice of the church is being sidelined more and more. Debate. I was trying to express in overly dramatic fashion what the complete secularization of our society could bring. And this is the quote. And so he said, what I was trying to do was I was talking to a group of priests and I was talking about what the secularization of the world would bring. And he said this, he said, I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. So Cardinal Francis George said this. He said, I expect to die as Archbishop in my bed. The Archbishop comes after me will die in prison. And the Archbishop after him will die a martyr in the public square. And then he goes on to say these very powerful words. His successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization as the church has done so often in human history. So the full quote is, I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization as the church has done so often in human history. What happens is that as the world turns away from rejecting God, as the world turns towards a selfishness, we see the very fabric of society that God is so much a part of, we see it begin to crumble, being experienced out there in the world. In my view, persecution of Christians will increase. Maybe not physically, maybe no one will take our lives, but discrimination against our values and opinions will increase and will be criticised, and increasingly those criticisms will be loud and will be done in a condescending and a very open manner. We will be seen as Christians to be somewhat naive and even immature in some of the views that we have. The truth is that I think our numbers will get smaller. Some people will still go to church because they've always gone to church. Some people will leave. The church was considered an illegal and if not even a depraved religion. Yet it would become, as we know, the official religion of Rome. As I say, there were no buildings. The earliest Christians didn't have them. They met in people's homes. There were no public events. There were no outreach days. There were no mail drops. There was no marketing. There was no advertising. Yet over the first 3 centuries, they grew widely and they grew diversely across nationalities. Some people say at the end of the first century there were 25,000 Christians. Some people put it at 20 million by the end. And the beginnings where they had maybe not been as devoted to one wife in the past, where they hated one another. And when they became Christians, they replaced that hate with love. They lived in a world of great racial discrimination, but they began to see themselves as one people regardless of race. They gave to whoever had need. You didn't have to be a Christian. You didn't have to be part of their group. They shared their possessions with one another. They lived a common life, a life where the things they did you could see, and it gave witness and example to the kind of life they lived. They prayed for their enemies. The one thing so often when people have done wrong that you don't want to do, perspective of this is just where life was going. Christians became known as those who cared for the sick. A matter of fact, Christians became known as people whose prayers were answered when the sick were in need of being prayed for. Christians also started the first Meals on Wheels. By the year 250, they were feeding more than 1,500 hungry and destitute people in Rome every day. In a paper written by Ken Curtis on the spread of the early church, he wrote some really fascinating things, and I'm just going to read them to you because they touched me. They touched me tremendously. It's a scandal, the emperor wrote. It's a scandal that there's not a single Jew who's a beggar, and that the Christians care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. While those who belong to us, the great mighty Roman Empire, look in vain for the help we should render them. See, what changed the world was the Christians lived as Christians. The Christians who were powerless, had no buildings, had no money, had no prestige or no position. The Christians lived powerfully. What would happen if today in our secular world, I'm just going to have the faith of my parents, or was at some point I'm going to stand up and I'm going to accept Christ into my life such that that faith was alive in me? That I wasn't just a church attender because that's what the rule book said. I was a church attender because of God who was revealed in my heart, in my life. That he sought a personal relationship with me that would change everything, and that I would become changed, and that I would live a life of power, of impact, of freedom, and of purpose. The question that we need to ask today is not whether the world agrees with us, but whether we agree with Christ, where we don't just believe in Christ, but we believe. Hey, what we need to do is we won't be able to shout down the loud voices of secularism. We won't. Not with our voice. Our voice is becoming quieter and quieter. The church is becoming softer and softer. Society is moving us to the side and to the side. What will transform the world is the way we live our lives.
You can watch the whole message now at brucedownsthecatholicguy.com.
Many years ago, a Catholic priest used to ask me all the time how my personal prayer was going, and I didn't know how to answer. Well, he taught me how to pray, and my life has never been the same. It's the most important thing I do in my life. So I wrote a book called Personal Prayer for the Everyday Person.